Picture this. June 24th, 1812. Over 500,000 soldiers, the largest army Europe had ever seen, stand at the edge of the Russian Empire. This is Napoleon Bonaparte's Grande Armée, a force of about 600,000 men from across his vast domain. Their mission: to bring Tsar Alexander I to his knees and solidify French control over the continent. With banners flying and confidence high, they crossed the Niemen River, marching into the vast, unknown expanse of Russia. But what awaited them was not a swift victory, but a catastrophic ordeal that would change the course of history forever. 6 months later, fewer than 100,000 of these soldiers would ever see their homes again. How did Napoleon's grand ambition turn into one of the most disastrous military campaigns in history? The invasion began with a clear objective: force a decisive battle, crush the Russian army, and dictate terms to the Tsar. Napoleon, the master of the battlefield, expected his enemies to meet him head-on. But the Russian commanders, men like Barclay de Tolly and later the wily Mikhail Kutuzov, had a different plan. They refused to play Napoleon's game. Instead of offering battle, they did the unthinkable. They retreated. And as they pulled back deeper and deeper into the heart of Russia, they employed a brutal, scorched earth policy. They burned everything. Crops in the fields, villages, even major towns were set ablaze. They left nothing for the advancing French army to live off of. The Grande Armée, designed for quick campaigns where it could forage for supplies, found itself marching through a desolate, ashen wasteland. Its long supply lines stretched thinner and thinner with every step. As the summer wore on, Napoleon's massive army began to shrink, not from major battles, but from disease, hunger, and desertion. The heat, the dust, and the endless marching took their toll. The soldiers were plagued by typhus, dysentery, and exhaustion. Thousands fell by the wayside without ever seeing a Russian soldier. Still, Napoleon pushed forward, obsessed with the idea of a single, decisive victory that would end the war. He believed that if he could just capture Moscow, the symbolic heart of Russia, the Tsar would have no choice but to surrender. The Russians knew they couldn't retreat forever. Public pressure and the need to defend their ancient capital finally forced them to make a stand. On September 7, 1812, near a small village called Borodino, about 75 miles west of Moscow, the two armies finally clashed. The Battle of Borodino was one of the single bloodiest days of the entire Napoleonic Wars. For over 12 hours, hundreds of thousands of men engaged in a ferocious and brutal fight. It was a head-on collision, a slogging match of artillery barrages and infantry charges against fortified positions. The French attacked relentlessly, and the Russians defended with stubborn, desperate courage. By the end of the day, the battlefield was a horrifying scene of carnage. The French had lost around 30,000 men, killed or wounded. Technically, Napoleon won the battle. The Russians, battered and bleeding, were forced to retreat and abandon Moscow. A week later, on September 14th, Napoleon rode triumphantly into the ancient city. But his victory was hollow. He entered a ghost town. The city was almost completely deserted. Its residents had fled, taking their valuables with them. Napoleon expected to find winter quarters, food, and supplies. Most importantly, he expected a delegation of Russian nobles to arrive, ready to sue for peace. He received none of it. Instead, just hours after his arrival, fires began to break out across the city, started by Russian agents on the orders of Moscow's governor. The fires quickly spread, fanned by strong winds. For 4 days, Moscow burned. The Great Fire of Moscow destroyed over 2/3 of the city, turning Napoleon's prize into a smoking ruin. The very shelter and supplies he was counting on to sustain his army through the winter went up in flames. For 5 weeks he waited. He sent peace offers to Tsar Alexander, but received no reply. The Tsar, far away in St. Petersburg, remained silent, refusing to negotiate while a single French soldier remained on Russian soil. Napoleon's position was becoming more untenable by the day. His soldiers were demoralized. Supplies were dwindling, and Russian partisans, along with Cossack cavalry, constantly harassed their foraging parties and communication lines. The great conqueror had been outmaneuvered, not by a great army in battle, but by space, by fire, and by the silent refusal of his enemy to surrender. The trap was sprung.
Oh, no.
On October 19, 1812, Napoleon finally gave the order he had delayed for far too long. Retreat. But this was no orderly withdrawal. The Grande Armée, now laden with loot from Moscow, but critically short on food, began the long, agonizing march back west. And then, the Russian winter, the infamous General Winter, arrived early and with a vengeance. Temperatures plummeted. Snow began to fall, turning the roads into icy, muddy quagmires. Frostbite and hypothermia became as deadly as any Russian bullet. Horses, essential for pulling cannons and supply wagons, died by the thousands from starvation and cold, forcing the men to abandon their artillery. The retreat devolved into a desperate flight for survival. The army disintegrated. What was once a disciplined force became a starving, freezing mob. Men broke ranks, searching for any scrap of food or shelter. They were relentlessly pursued by the Russian army and attacked by peasant militias. The most horrific moment of the retreat came in late November. At the crossing of the Berezina River, the main Russian army had moved to cut off Napoleon's escape route. In a desperate and brilliant feat of military engineering, French pontoon builders worked in the freezing water to construct makeshift bridges. Over 2 days, under constant artillery fire and attack, the core of the army managed to get across. But thousands of stragglers, camp followers, and wounded were left behind on the eastern bank. When the bridges were destroyed to prevent Russian pursuit, these unfortunate souls were either killed, captured, or drowned trying to cross the icy river. The Berezina became a symbol of the campaign's ultimate horror. The remnants of the Grande Armée stumbled on, a column of ghosts limping through the snow. Of the more than 600,000 men who had marched into Russia with such pride 5 months earlier, fewer than 100,000 made it back across the Niemen River. Most of those were sick, frostbitten, or utterly broken. Napoleon himself had abandoned the army in early December, racing ahead to Paris in a sleigh to raise a new army and shore up his political position. He had gambled everything on a quick victory, and he had lost spectacularly. The Russian campaign was more than just a military defeat. It was the destruction of his greatest instrument of power. The myth of his invincibility was shattered. The disaster in Russia had profound consequences for all of Europe. It emboldened Napoleon's enemies. Prussia, long a resentful ally of France, switched sides and joined Russia. Austria soon followed. A new, powerful coalition formed against him. The war that had begun in the vast plains of Russia now moved back into Central Europe, culminating in the massive Battle of Leipzig in 1813. The Battle of the Nations, where Napoleon was decisively defeated. This led to his first abdication in exile in 1814. The 1812 invasion, strategic gamble aimed at cementing his control over Europe, had done the exact opposite. It destroyed his finest army, drained his empire of resources and manpower, and united his enemies against him. The long march to Moscow and the catastrophic retreat marked the beginning of the end for the Napoleonic Empire. The dream of a Europe united under French rule died in the snows of Russia. Thank you so much for watching. The story of Napoleon's 1812 campaign is a powerful lesson in the limits of ambition and the unforgiving nature of war. If you found this video interesting, please hit that like button. Subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into history's most pivotal moments. Let us know in the comments what other historical events you'd like us to cover. See you in the next video.